Hi everyone, Dr. Gross here, and congratulations, you've made it to the final part of this webinar series on APA format and citation. Previously, we talked about the general guidelines for formatting a paper in APA style, as well as how to handle in-text citations for the sources that you're referencing in your writing. This third part will be focusing specifically on full citations that would appear in your reference page for your paper. So let's get started. So a full citation or a reference generally has four elements. It'll have the author, so who's responsible for writing this work. It'll have the date, or when was this work published. It'll have the title, what's the work called, and it'll have the source, or where can you retrieve this work, who published it. Let's look at some examples. This slide talks about what to do or how to handle a single, multiple, or unknown, or organization as author for the different sources you might be working with in your full citations. So let's take a look at that before we talk about the different kinds of sources you might be encountering. You'll see in this first example that if you only have a single author, you'll list the author's last name, comma, and then the initials of their first and middle name. That'll be followed by, a period, punctuation mark, and then the publication date in parentheses. And we'll look at the rest of that information as we continue. But right now, let's just look at what we're doing with the authors in these citations. So that was single author. If you have two authors, as you can see the second example, it'll be in the source, the first author who's listed, their last name, comma, and then first and middle name initials, followed by a comma, and then you've got the ampersand and the second author's last name, comma, and then their first and middle initials. This is different for the 7th edition of APA, even though in your in-text citation, if you have 3 or more authors for a source, you're just going to list the first author's last name and then et al. Here in your full citation in the references page for a source like that, you would list out every author up to 20. And then if there's more than that, after 20, you could put ... to cut those authors out. And then just put the last author that shows up in the list for that source to round it all off. So 20 authors, ... and then the last author, and cut out whoever's in between. If you don't know who the author of the source is, you would skip to what would come next. And in this case, that would be the title of the source. So you list the title in the place of the author if there's no known author. And then this last example in the table shows what to do if it has an organization as an author. You'll spell out the full name of that organization, in this example, American Psychological Association, instead of a person's name as the author. Okay, this slide is focusing on how to handle specifically citations for periodicals. And by that, I mean an article that would show up in a journal that has multiple issues ongoing, or a magazine or a newspaper, for example. So let's look at that first example in the table. This is a journal article with a DOI. That's an identification number or URL. A lot of articles that you would find in library databases do have a DOI. So that's what you would include for them. And now instead of putting DOI and then the number, you would put use the URL address for the DOI. So this shows the author's last name, comma, first and middle initials, period, publication date, in parentheses, period, and then the title of the article, period, followed by the title of the journal in which this article is found, comma, you've got your volume number and the issue number for the journal. Pay attention to capitalization here and italics that are used, and punctuation as well. So after volume and issue number, you've got the comma, and then you've got the page range for this article, period, and then the URL DOI. Here in the second example, you have a journal article that does not have a DOI. So maybe this is a print journal article, for example. So it looks pretty much the same as the one above, except it ends with the page range and doesn't include the DOI. If you have a journal article without a DOI, but it does have a non-database URL, that means you didn't necessarily get it out of like a library database, you found it just online, Google searching or something like that, then you could put the URL instead of the DOI. So this is what that could look like. And then let's say, for example, you have an online magazine or a newspaper article. This would have the author's last name, comma, first name, initial, period. And then in addition to the year of publication, it also has the exact date, month and day. It's got the title of the piece and then the title of the publication in which that piece is found. And then it has the URL that would take you to that piece if you clicked it. And finally, in this slide, we have an example of a print magazine or newspaper article. So here, the thing that's different is instead of the URL address, you just have the section number of the newspaper at the end. Let's take a look at how you would handle citations for books. So basically, the most basic book that you would have the author's name, how you would usually cite it there, and then the date of publication. Then you have the title of the book, and then you have the publisher. One thing that's different in the 7th edition of APA is previously you had to put the location of publication, but now it's just the publisher's name and not the location. The second example in this slide is for an edited book. So in that case, you have the author, date of publication, title of the source, and then you have the editor's name here, followed by ED in parentheses after the title of the piece and before the publisher. If you have a translated version of a book, instead of the editor, we would put the translator's name followed by trans to stand for translator. And then you could also put their original work published in whatever that date would be. So original publication 1814, this translated version published 1951. If you have just an article or chapter within an edited book, and that's the only thing that you want to cite, not the whole book, you would do the author's name, publication date, and then the title of that chapter. And then you would put the editor, if the source has an editor, and you can see this one is formatted slightly differently. It's the editor for the whole collection in B.R. Wainrib, editor. And then this is the title of the whole book in which this chapter or article is found. And then you also include the page range for that article within the book and the publisher. If you have an ebook, this looks just slightly different after the title of that piece. You would include the narrator's name if that's available to you, followed by NARR standing for narrator. And then you would have in brackets that this is an audio book. you've got the publisher, and then you've also got a URL to retrieve that audiobook in addition to the rest of the information there. Here's just a few other common sources that you might be dealing with at times. For example, a whole website or a page on a website. So that's what this would look like. This first example of the US Census Bureau, no date for publication, the title of that page, and the organization that put this information out, or that whole website. And then we have here retrieved date from, and then the URL. So this is different. You didn't see retrieved in the previous slides because this information, this particular web page that's tracking the world population, that is meant to change day to day or however often. So it's updated regularly. So we would want to include that information about when we retrieved it and from where. Sometimes you will be citing some kind of report, maybe from a government site or organization site. So here's an example of what that might look like. We have an organization as the author here. We have the specific date in which this information was found, or in which it was published. And then we have the title of this report, and we have here that it was actually a press release. So we put that information in brackets so the reader would clearly know what kind of source this was. And then also the URL for which to access this source. One thing that's cool about the newest edition of APA is that it has information about how to handle a lot of new media types of sources. For example, if you were citing some tweets in your paper, maybe you're doing some kind of Twitter analysis or pulling some of the newest information that isn't available elsewhere other than on social media. So this is an example of what a tweet would look like. It also has information about how to cite film and video, and even how to cite a podcast episode. So if you want to look in more depth at any of these sources, you can pause the video and take a look. I also included in here a slide that has information about how to handle legal references that you might be citing or pulling information from. So a lot of different kinds of legal references, cases, court decision, laws, legislative materials, executive materials, constitutions and charters, treaties and conventions. So you may be having to work from any of these types of legal documents and reference them. And APA has a lot of good information about how to do that. It actually has a whole section in the print style manual. If this is something you do often, it'd be worth investing in that to use as a reference. But I'm not going to go into detail on each of these. You're welcome to pause it and take a further look if you wish, but I'm going to keep going for now. Okay, briefly before we finish this webinar, I do want to talk to you about a few special considerations for citing sources in APA style. The first example of this, and it's something that you probably have or will encounter at some point, it's indirect citations, and generally, or that means quoting a source that is quoted in another source. So you're working from the secondary source then. So the general advice for this scenario, if you want to cite a source that is referenced in the source that you're actually accessing, is go and find the original source if at all possible. If you can get access to the source that you want to cite that you found within another source, go and find the original one. Sometimes you won't be able to do that, so this slide shows you how to handle it if you can't get to the original source, but if you can, that's what's recommended by APA. And I'll also point out here too, before I take a look at these examples, that for your in-text citations and your references list citations, they should fully align with one another, meaning that every time you cite a source in the text, you should have a corresponding full citation to that source in your references list and vice versa. So if you are doing an indirect citation, here on the left side of this slide is what it would look like for your in-text citation. You just need to make it clear whose idea you're actually referencing and where you found it. So you could say Turner, and then your parenthetical, as cited in Lawrence, 1923, found blah, 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 blah. Or you could say it was found that, and then cite the idea, or reference the idea, and then include your full, or your parenthetical citation, Turner, comma, as cited in Lawrence, 1923. So Lawrence is the secondary source. That's the one you're working with, but you want to cite Turner's idea, which was referenced in Lawrence, in the Lawrence source. If that was your in-text citation in this paper, your references list would show a citation for the Lawrence source. That's the one that you were working with. So Lawrence DH 1923, there's a title of it, and so on and so forth. So we're not actually going to see Turner in your references list. We'll see Lawrence, but in the text we know that Turner is found in Lawrence. Here's another scenario you might encounter that you're missing publication information. So for example, you might be missing the author, and we've talked about how you would just move to the next thing, which would be the title of that source, and that's what you use instead of the author. If the source you're working with doesn't have a publication date, you use ND to stand for no date. If it doesn't have a page number, then you could count by paragraph if that seems reasonable and feasible to do. And this is what that would look like. Instead of P25, it would be paragraph 6 or para 6. If you're missing some of that information, you can see on the right how you would handle that in your references list citations. If there's no author, you use the title. If there's no publication date, you use ND. If there's no page numbers, it's probably not a big deal unless it's maybe an article within a journal. But you could either use paragraphs there or just leave that information out. Okay, let's also talk briefly about capitalization conventions for your citations. You probably noticed that in your in-text citations, when you're referencing the title of a text from what we talked about previously, if it's a standalone text or of complete work, such as a book, you would italicize the title and also use title case. And by title case, I mean you're capitalizing all of the first letter of all of the important words there. So not prepositions, not conjunctions, not articles, but any other kind of word you would capitalize for title case. If it's a work that's a part of a whole, for example, a journal article, then you would quote the title instead of italicize it and use title case still. Now look at these in the references list. If you're dealing with a standalone text such as a book, you're going to use italics, same as you would if you're referencing the title in the text of the paper. However, now you're using sentence case instead of title case. And I put a little asterisk there because the exception to this is if it's a journal title. So if we look at the second example here on the right, this is a journal article, Impact of Parental and Adolescent Personality on Parenting. That journal article as a part of a whole is going to use sentence case and not have quotation marks or italics or anything, but then we're going to put the journal title after the article title, and for the journal title we will use sentence case, and it's also we're going to use title case and it'll be italicized. Sorry about that. All right, now I'm going to wrap up this webinar, this section specifically talking about references, citations, with a concluding activity. And this is something that you'll do on your own. I just kind of want to introduce it and encourage you to follow through. Use some of the online resources that I shared with you about APA style in the first video for this webinar. Use those resources or your own copy of the APA style manual to find the answer to a question that you still have about APA format or citation that was not addressed in this webinar. So what do you still want to know? What did I not cover, or what are you still confused about? See if you can find the answer to that. And when you do, I'd encourage you to share it with your classmates because maybe they would benefit from it as well. So do that on your own time. And before I finish this video completely, I would just encourage you to also consider the Writing Center to be one of your resources that you have when you're trying to figure out APA style or any other kind of writing issue. And I like to say even really great writers, people who consider themselves to be great writers, should definitely still use the Writing Center because anyone can benefit from making some time to talk about their writing with another writer. So here's how you can make an appointment with the Writing Center. You just sign into MyLMU, click on the main menu, and under academics, you'll see a link for writing and course tutoring. And that's what you'll click. It'll take you to our schedule where you can view tutors' availability and schedule an appointment. All of our sessions right now are taking place online. You can also make an appointment for a collaborative writing project where all of your group members come to that appointment and talk at the same time. And if you want more information about the Writing Center, you can check out our website. You can email writing@lmu.edu. You could also follow us on Instagram at LMUARC. And I'll just point out that we do have graduate student writers or graduate student tutors on our staff. If you prefer working with a graduate student, we have undergraduate and graduate tutors. All of the tutors are trained in writing pedagogy. If you want help with editing your paper, I would just let you know that the tutor that you're working with will likely look for patterns in your writing and teach you some skills to be able to self-edit your work in the future moving forward. If you want to look at an entire chapter of your thesis with a tutor, you should maybe be prepared to schedule multiple 1-hour sessions with them. And also I'd encourage you to schedule your appointments early, like, maybe a week or so in advance when you know you're going to want to have them, because our schedule can get pretty full, especially toward the end of the semester. Our tutors are great, and they can help clarify anything that didn't make sense in this webinar or anything you need to go over in more detail one-on-one with someone. So I definitely encourage you to check out the Writing Center, and we hope to see you for a session sometime soon. Okay, let us know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching in this webinar series.